The Last Question by Isaac Asimov. Magic Edition. In the first era, the era of paper magic, two players sit across a table, cards in hand. One says to the other, "If you cast Dark Ritual on turn 1, which spell do you play first? Hymn to Turak or Thoughtseize?" The other thinks and says, "Hymn. It has the potential to disrupt more." The second era, the online age. In an online game of Magic Online, a chat window pops up. One player types, "Turn 1 Dark Ritual, Hymn or Thoughtseize?" The other responds, "Thoughtseize. Better to know what they have and pick the most dangerous card." Third era, the age of AI analysis. A streamer asks their AI assistant, "For turn 1 Dark Ritual, what's the statistically better play, Hymn or Thoughtseize?" The AI calculates. Thoughtseize has a 53.7% chance of leading to a win if played first. The fourth era, the age of advanced simulation. A researcher immerses themselves in a holographic magic simulation. Simulate a million games. Turn 1 Dark Ritual, Hymn or Thoughtseize. After a moment, the simulation responds. Hymn to Turak leads to a favorable outcome in 50.8% of the games. Fifth era, the age of universal understanding. A consciousness, once a person but now existing as pure thought, asks the universe, "In the grand scheme of things, for the first turn Dark Ritual, which truly is the better choice?" The universe contemplates and responds, "Both have their merits. It depends on context." Sixth era, the end of the multiverse. All is darkness, silence, emptiness. Only one question remains, echoing through the void. Turn 1 Dark Ritual, Hymn or Thoughtseize? The answer comes from the remnants of the universe's consciousness. Are you on the play or on the draw?
Hello and welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy and I am here as always with my co-host, Anthony. Squirrel Nest is a control card Maddox.
Squirrel Nest isn't every kind of card. It's a control card, it's a combo card, it's a aggro squirrel tribal card.
How's it an aggro card?
Well, everything,
tell me the ways.
Because context always matters, and maybe a 4-mana 1/1 is the most aggressive thing you're doing in a format.
That would be quite impressive. I mean, it's not impossible, but it would be pretty impressive. Anthony, this week's episode concept comes to us from a friend of the show, Aaron. We had him on to discuss his Kamigawa Remastered Cube earlier this spring, and he was saying he was going through the back catalog and listened to the ABCs of Aggro. One of our first episodes, I think. I think within the first 10 or 15 episodes was the ABCs of Aggro. And he asked the very obvious question, where are the ABCs of all the other archetypes episodes? And I think learning to understand aggro is like especially important as a cube designer because it does so much to establish the meta of an environment.
Yeah, the fastest deck really sets the tone because everybody's got to figure out how to have a plan against the fastest deck, and then you can sort of, once you figure out how to have that plan, you can build on that and do some other things, but it just sets the tempo, right?
Yeah, I do think the rest kind of falls into place, and I think that is maybe the reason why we addressed aggro as an archetype so early, because we were talking about it largely from the perspective of like a cube designer, maybe not as much a player, though it was a little bit we touched on in there. But I think it makes sense to come back to these other macro archetypes, themes, whatever you want to call them. I think John Terrell has called them theaters before, the theater of control and the theater of aggro. Words fail us in Magic because Magic's complicated and words are not. But I think it makes sense to come back to it, and so this week we are going to cover the basics of control. And I have a lot of notes here. I think this is largely about like setting some terms, some like clear shared understanding, talking a little bit about what it means to pilot a control deck as a player, and I think a lot of that will kind of shine a light naturally on what that means for a cube design. But if you have specific ideas about how to address control decks as a cube designer, we can also talk about that. And I should say, too, this is largely my reckonings of what a control deck is from our experience drafting a variety of cubes. We're largely talking in the context of draft and cube, though I think a lot of these lessons are going to be more broad and can apply in lots of different contexts. And if I'm influenced by anything, I definitely did reread a somewhat notable article by Reed Duke leading up to this, which I put in the show notes. I think it's just called Control is the title of the article from, a decade ago on the Mothership. I also in the past have read Next Level Deck Building, which I agree with some of the things that Patrick lays out. I think some others are maybe not as clearly defined, but that certainly has influenced a lot of my thinking about this too. It'd be wrong to say it hasn't. It's Andy from the editing booth. So I was looking for this article that I thought was by Paulo Vitor Damarosa, all about the different archetypes of control leading up to this episode, and I couldn't find it. Google was failing me, and then someone else had sent me this article by Reed Duke, and I was like, maybe I was just thinking of this article by Reed Duke. Then we recorded the episode. Then YOLO Swag Boy on the MTT Cube Talk Discord did in fact turn up the article by Paulo Vitor Damarosa I was thinking of. It was formerly on Channel Fireball, which now no longer exists because capitalism yeeted it into the sun, but you can still find it on the web archive. So that link is also going to be in the show notes, and that similarly has heavily influenced my thinking on control, as you will see in what I say in this episode. I read the article again after recording the episode, and sure enough, I was parroting a lot of Paulo's ideas throughout. So, lots of good resources in the show notes for you to check out. Either way, to me, a control deck is a deck that is defined by trying to stop its opponent's plan rather than enact its own proactive strategy. It's right in the name. It wants to control the game more than it wants to apply pressure or just try and win right out of the gate.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is obviously going to look different in different contexts, but I think that the sort of like overarching theme that hopefully we can come up with something that's broad enough that is not going to be too disagreeable is really about that spectrum of the aggressive decks care most about their opponent's life total, and they're focused on getting that down to zero as quickly as possible, and not so much thinking about other things like card advantage and tempo. It's just about that life total. Whereas control decks are kind of doing the opposite. They're at the other end of the spectrum. They're trying to take things slow, and that means dealing with their opponent's threats, stopping what the opponent is doing, and shaping the entire game towards where they can win. And often the win conditions, I think, are really, really where it gets variable between different environments, because it could be Squirrel Nest, it could be attacking you with a Celestial Colonnade, it could be dropping a big Planeswalker, or just casting an ultimatum or something. But the point is,
or
you
perhaps
just want
a giant brain geyser in the Neoclassical Cube.
Absolutely. And I think that in a way there's like so much more variety in control decks than there are in aggressive decks, just because once you have control over the game, you can kind of go in a lot of directions and build your deck to a lot of different endpoints. Whereas when you're just focused on ending the game as quickly as possible and focusing on getting your opponent's life total to zero, that's kind of, it's a little bit more linear. It's a little bit more focused.
Less wiggle room.
Yeah.
It's a little bit easier to look at any two given cards and say which of these is more aggressive. That's a pretty straightforward calculation. Like, which of these is going to get my opponent's life total lower sooner? And obviously, I'm sure people could disagree on certain things, like what's more aggressive, a Hell Rider or a Jackal Pup. We're not going to get into that, but that's a more like clear axis than like looking at two cards and saying like which one's more of a control card. It's like, well, control decks need lots of different kinds of cards. They're not as interchangeable as other decks. Like an aggro deck can largely be just a bunch of creatures and ways to burn your opponent out or some form of reach. Control decks, I think, do have a more specific mixture or texture of cards that sort of make them tick, and for that reason, I think you're right. They are more varied.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Even the method of controlling a deck can take a lot of different forms. In creature-heavy sort of environments, it's going to be potentially about playing a lot of Wraths. It might be more about a lot of like single-target removal and combining that with draw spells in order to sort of maintain that card advantage while you're dealing with your opponent's threats, things like that. And who knows, in another environment, it might be all about disenchants if the environment is really about artifacts and enchantments.
Yeah, I have in my notes here. I think we should talk through all these like abstract notes. I think that we should also at the end address just like what control decks look like in each of the cubes we curate, because I think there's a lot of variety just in those. I have like the 4 cubes that, I mean, Turbo kind of plays by its own rules. But if you put that aside, you look at Bun Magic, regular cube, the Neoclassical Cube and the Degenerate Micro Cube, I think that's a pretty broad sampling of like what control decks can be in just those 4 cubes. So we'll definitely cover how they differ based on the environment. I do think that card advantage in some form is basically essential to control. This is a point that Reed Duke drives home in his article. Now, card advantage is a more abstract idea than just drawing cards. It can take many different forms, but I do think that if you are in fact a control deck, if you are playing to late game inevitability, if you are planning to win after you've exhausted your opponent's resources and stopped their deck, you're going to need some form of card advantage, right? Cards are the atomic unit in some ways of Magic, and you can't run out of cards if your plan is to control the game. You have to have more than your opponent in some way.
Yeah, that's a great point, because there are a couple different resources in Magic, and different decks will care about different ones. Again, the aggressive decks care about the resource of life, and the control decks, there has to be a reason to care about some other resource, and the reason is, if you focus on card advantage purely, you can actually generate a ton of advantage, and using your initial life total as a buffer, eventually sort of turn the game around and make it about that resource game that you can take control of.
So there are different types of control decks, broadly speaking. As we said, I think it differs a lot based on the environment you're playing, but they do kind of fit into broad buckets. To me, there's like 2 really big buckets that I think kind of encompass pretty much all types of control decks, and those buckets are draw-go control and tap-out control. And as the names imply, I think these decks are basically defined by the speed at which they play. Draw-go control decks are designed to play at instant speed as much as possible, and they are full of lots of stack interaction, lots of counterspells, because they're taking advantage of the fact that they're playing at instant speed, meaning they can always choose whether or not they're going to counter what their opponent did just now, or advance their board state with a flash creature, or they're going to cycle a Shark Typhoon and make a shark on the end step. They just are always kind of waiting to the last moment. They're playing very reactively, basically, and reactive specifically in a way that they are playing at instant speed and holding up mana for as much of the game as possible. I think blue is essential to these decks. I don't think you can play draw-go control absent blue.
Not yet, at least in 2023. We'll see.
Not yet.
We'll see how many more white remands we get in the future.
We'll see how this color pie keeps evolving. But right now, I think it's pretty essential. I think these decks also tend to play not to the board almost at all, right? At least relative to the other decks in the meta they're playing in, whatever cube they're playing in. Because very rarely do you have a meta where you have tons of board-affecting instant speed spells. If you, by definition, are trying to hold up counterspells the whole game, unless you have like a whole flash archetype in your cube where there's a ton of creatures with flash, you probably aren't playing to the board as much, which then in turn means that you're probably also taking advantage of board wipes, because board wipes are a source of card advantage. If you cast one card that destroys 3 of your opponent's cards, that's just as much card advantage as drawing cards is. And you're inherently breaking the symmetry on those board wipes because you are inherently playing to the board much less because you're inherently playing at instant speed. All these things are kind of related to each other and start to form the shape of an archetype.
Right. I mean, I think it's also important in there that counterspells, you're usually countering something that is more expensive than the cost of the counterspell, which means
Ideally.
You're also generating a mana advantage, which hopefully then you can also mean you're spending mana at the same time on additional draw spells and things to, again, generate that card advantage.
Yeah, the dream is you counterspell their thing and then you opt, right? And now you have got a little card selection, you're keeping the cards flowing, and you've answered your opponent's 3-drop with your 2-mana spell, and you keep on advancing your board state. I think the other hallmark of these draw-go control decks is that they very often have a, like, turning the corner moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Again, because they are playing at instant speed, very often the best threats or the best win conditions, the best inevitability for these decks is still sorcery speed. It's still going to be, you're going to play a Planeswalker, you're going to, play some big bomb spell, or in some cases, in my cube, one of my favorite ways to win with a draw-go control deck is just to, once you have 7 mana, play out your Monastery Mentor, and you still have counter spells in hand, you still have all these interactive spells and card draw spells, and then you can just win in a turn or two with this really explosive turning the corner type action. But I think this turning the corner moment is emblematic of these decks. Again, I think all these things kind of just domino one into the other, right? Because you're trying to play a lot of counter spells, all these other things are, in many environments, kind of incumbent on wanting to play with a lot of counter magic.
Yeah, I mean, it's a strategy that is not necessarily based on just one card type, which is an interesting thing to compare to aggressive decks, which they'll often play a variety of things because, you want your, maybe creatures are the most efficient way to deal damage, and you also want some burn to balance it out to be able to remove blockers. That is true, but not to the same extent. You could definitely have an aggressive deck in a lot of environments that is just 90% creatures, or
I mean, you could literally have an aggressive deck that was just creatures.
Yeah.
I mean, it would have weaknesses, but
that's a good way to put it, yeah.
But if a lot of those creatures, I mean, it's not that hard to imagine that some of those creatures being Grim Lavamancers and Flame Tongue Kavus and stuff that can still also affect the board. Like, it's entirely feasible to have a deck that is just creatures that's still an aggro deck.
Right, but you can't have just a bad control deck with only wraths and nothing else. That's just
only
that's just
counterspells.
a non-functional
It literally
deck.
doesn't function. You can't possibly win the game. So, yeah, by definition, I think there's more texture to what a control deck consists of. And we'll get to that more as we talk about how to draft these decks eventually. Does that sound comprehensive enough for draw, go, control?
I mean, comprehensive enough is, I think for our purposes, absolutely.
Great. The corollary for that is tap out control. And again, as the name suggests, this is a control deck that instead of playing at instant speed, plays mostly at sorcery speed. And that means that it's primarily answering threats once they've resolved instead of on the stack, with a lot of removal in most environments for creatures. Creatures are going to be the bread and butter of most types of cubes and limited, so you're going to need a lot of creature removal. And they often generate card advantage in board-affecting ways rather than non-board affecting ways, where your draw-go control deck is very happy to just end-step a Factor Fiction because they didn't need to counter something. These decks are more likely to play things like Muldrifter or Planeswalkers or Ravenous Chupacabras, things that are going to both generate card advantage and affect the board. They're kind of like playing these cards that do it all, essentially, to help them cover the full spread of what their opponent might be doing.
Yeah, and again, it's all about the sort of interplay of the efficiency of the different types of resources, of cards as a resource, of mana as a resource, and life as a resource. And you can get that advantage in a lot of environments very efficiently with counterspells that cost only 2 mana, but that also might not be advancing your board or your own game plan at the same time. So this is just another style where you can generate that advantage through things that interact in multiple ways at once.
This maybe varies a little more based on context, but I find these decks are very often many-colored, like more than 2 colors. I think oftentimes they are taking advantage of the best of those class of cards I just described across multiple colors. They want the ways to get card advantage and affect the board simultaneously, and are willing to go a little deeper into other colors to support that. And instead of having these like turn the corner moments, these decks really just are full of kind of incidental threats and win conditions, right? Like they'll just kill you with the Muldrifter. Like it's just a 2/2 flyer for 5 mana. It's not an efficient body, but if you've continue to just grind your opponent into dust with card advantage or removal spells, it will eventually just kill them. So it's got this kind of like ongoing inevitability that's kind of happening. And similarly, because you're playing to the board a lot, you often don't find board wipes in these kinds of decks because you are going to want to be playing to the board from an early part of the game, so you're not going to have that symmetry to break, so you're not going to put the board wipes in your deck in the first place.
Sure, so it's less about the controlling the game and having your one big explosive turn with your Monastery Mentor and then a counterspell in 2 instants. It's more about just controlling the game from the very beginning and really just winning the game based on attrition and neutralizing all your opponent's threats while you're slowly presenting your own clock.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
It is. I think sometimes these specific types of control decks can get muddled with just a mid-range deck.
Sure.
And to me, I think the balance of like clock and inevitability are important there. So when I think about like a classic Jund deck after the like Jund modern deck, like to me that's a quintessential mid-range deck. And that deck is also playing to the board. It's also generating card advantage while playing to the board simultaneously. But importantly, it's presenting a pretty fast clock, and it doesn't have the best inevitability, right? Like at a certain point, it's just top decking, and it's emptying its own hand with things like Liliana of the Veil, right? It's trying to put on pressure while also generating value. Whereas when I think about decks that are winning with, Muldrifter or something, like they're not concerned with the clock really at all. You will often just go many turns in a tap-out control deck without attacking at all because it doesn't really matter. You'll kill them eventually. You're slowly building up this advantage and just grinding them into dust. And so I think the relationship to the like life totals and the like clock is what differentiates a mid-range deck, which we'll do a whole episode in the future, I guess, from a like tap-out control deck, which sometimes players, I think they're like, oh, well, control, you need counterspells. I think you definitely don't. The slowest deck in an environment is going to be a control deck, and in some environments, it's just not going to be a deck full of counterspells, and I think that's where tap-out control really shines. Oh, anytime we try and make a comprehensive episode like this about a big abstract topic, it is a recipe for lots of interjections in the editing booth. Thinking on it a little more, I think another way to pretty clearly distinguish a mid-range deck from a tap-out control deck is what its strategy is against a opposing control deck. And I think a mid-range deck, by definition, is going to try and go under its control opponents, and again, we'll have to talk about mid-range in a whole other episode in the future. Whereas a tap-out control deck, I think, is still going to try and win the game with inevitability and card advantage rather than switching up to a more aggressive strategy, which is what mid-range decks often tend to do when they're up against control. So that's maybe another distinction. You can look at its relationship to the life total clock, and you can look at how the deck is designed to handle its matchup against an opposing control deck. Is it still trying to win based on attrition, or does it switch its strategy up to be more aggressive, making it more of a mid-range deck? Back to your regularly scheduled programming.
I feel like we're sort of nebulously talking about control in cubes, but I think there's also a lot that references or comes from sort of the themes that we see in constructed decks, obviously, as well. Do you, and you have a little bit more knowledge of sort of the constructed metagames, somewhat. So when you're talking about these like multicolor control decks, is that coming more from your cube experience, or do you see that more often? I mean, especially it feels like with triomes that have really shaped a lot of constructed formats.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's coming. I'm picturing in my head cube decks from my own cubes mostly that I can think of where it's like, this feels like a very strong tap-out control deck, and it's usually like 3, maybe 4 colors or splashing something.
Splashing a red and 6.
Yeah, splashing red and 6, or I think in my cube specifically, and we can talk more about what control decks look like in the Bud Magic cube, I have a lot of gold removal, and specifically a lot of gold removal that has the potential for card advantage. Things like Kolgan's Command is a great example. I think that's like a quintessential, I mean, that's an instance. You can play that in any kind of control deck, but if you're playing that in like a base green deck, right, you're probably doing some sort of like tap-out control. I guess you could be doing Jund there. That card does everything.
Yeah.
But
I mean, you'll always take a thing that is an instant if it's the same power level. It's just often because of the way cards are designed, the things that are at instant speed are going to be adjusted in terms of power level, so you are kind of making a choice there.
Yeah, the tap-out control decks, I think maybe another way to describe them succinctly is that like you're just trying to play better cards than your opponent, just like raw card quality. And like you said, at sorcery speed, you're going to get a higher quality card than for the same cost at instant speed because you got to pay for the advantage instant speed confers.
But sometimes Wizards does different things.
Sometimes they do different things. So anyway, because in the Bud Magic Cube, there's a lot of really good gold removal. I think oftentimes those tap-out control decks end up seeping into other colors to take advantage of that gold removal and then playing red and 6 alongside Uro, alongside K-Command. And it's like, here's my, 4-color deck. And that actually is kind of similar to what 4-color control looks like in Legacy right now. There is definitely a 4-color control deck in Legacy that is basically Uro is the win condition. That's pretty much it. And then you're just playing the best other types of answers and removal spells to kind of go along with that. And you're happy to go into 4 colors because you are planning to control the game from the beginning. So you use your life total as a resource. Though in Legacy with duels, your life total is not as much of a question there. It's more about playing around Wastelands and Blood Moons. It's a whole different thing. Anyway, I'm thinking mostly about Cube when I think about these kinds of control decks. But I do think there's a history of them in Constructed, obviously, as well.
For sure, and it definitely informs the way that people design and draft cubes as well.
I think most control decks can kind of fit into these 2 buckets. There definitely are a bunch of other subcategories. One that I think we should mention, but I don't think comes up very often in cubes, is like a prison or stacks deck. I think that definitely qualifies as a control deck. In some ways, it's a more proactive control deck. You're just trying to establish a lock that means your opponent's deck can't do its thing at all because you've shut them down with some combination of cards. These decks,
I think there's still like a big tempo aspect to that in that you need to get the lock established quickly enough so your opponent isn't still like racing you in terms of resources, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's been a while since we talked about tempo on the podcast, and it's guaranteed to get us some letters. We always get comments when we talk about tempo. I don't like the idea of a tempo deck because I think that every deck has to care about tempo, right? Like, aggro decks win on tempo in the sense that...
It's like talking about tempo music. Every song has a tempo. It's just the changes in tempo and the differences in tempo that are important.
Well, I think this is also really important when it comes to control decks. Like, what will make control decks different from environment to environment is largely what the tempo of that environment is. In the Bud Magic Cube, things are very, very fast. You cannot just wait until you cast your board wipe on turn 4, because in the first 4 turns of the game, you might take 16 or 18 damage, and you just can't afford to do that. So things like Disfigures are great in control decks and other decks in that cube, because you have to answer the early threats before you get to a board wipe. So the tempo of the environment really shapes what control looks like, because, again, the whole deck is about stopping your opponent's strategy. You have to know what their strategy is, care about how fast it is, care about how it's trying to kill you in order to stop it. So anyway, yes, I think all these decks have to care about tempo just as much as an aggro deck does, just in a different way. I think Reed Duke in the article says that, aggro decks set the tempo, and the job of a control deck is to keep up with the tempo. You can't ignore it. You can't just do your own thing. You have to respect the tempo at which the aggro deck is playing and meet it on its own terms in order to shut it down.
Yeah, I know on limited resources they call it defensive speed.
So anyway, yeah, these prison stacks decks, I think... we don't see them in most cubes because they tend to require very narrow cards that don't fit in any other kind of deck, and often your deck needs to be kind of all about that strategy in order for it to work. And so the result is like kind of a very on-rails thing that most cube designers don't like to include.
Yeah, I feel like there's a thing that happens often in like someone designing a new cube is they look at Black Braids Cabal minion, and they're like, oh, I could make this like stacks theme, and also this is just reasonable top end for aggro. Let's try it out, because it's like not super narrow, and then it often ends up being both super narrow and not that reasonable to play.
That's not what I was thinking when I was thinking of prison or stacks decks, but I guess it does kind of fit the bill.
That fits the bill. That's exactly the bill.
The thing I find with that card specifically is that in most cubes, I found that your opponent's deck might accidentally be just as good of a Black Braids deck as your deck is. They might also just have planeswalkers that make tokens, and you're like, oh, great. I'm glad we're both doing this symmetrical thing I'm trying to take advantage of.
You know what? I've been on the other side of that before, and it was pretty funny.
I also think that combo plays into this space in an interesting way. I think a lot of control decks you will find combo win conditions because, again, the decks have more room for variety or different types of cards. You can't just really drop, let's say Splinter Twin combo into an aggro deck because those cards are not very good aggro cards. So if you don't draw them both, then your whole thing doesn't really work. You're just playing suboptimal threats in your deck that's just trying to get your opponent dead. If you're playing a control deck, however, and you have lots of card selection, lots of time on your hands, your goal is just to win the game inevitably somehow, you have plenty of time to put these two cards together and win the game however you want. So whether that's Kiki combo or Helm combo or Painter's Servant combo, whatever combo you want, insert it here. I think those often find their best home in control decks because they just are a compact and concise way to give you that inevitability, where just eventually I'll win because eventually I'll get my combo.
I think it goes to a few points of just having more time to make use of a handful of cards in the deck, and also just needing some sense of inevitability, some way to eventually win the game. Plus, if you have counter spells, things like that, you're in a place where you can much more easily protect a combo if it requires things sticking around for a turn or multiple permanents resolving.
Yep, exactly. I thought we could talk a little bit about some of the advantages of just playing a control deck. Why you might want to draft control as opposed to other archetypes.
Well, so you can win would be the answer to any question.
I mean, that's
right?
always true, but I think there are intrinsic advantages to these styles of decks. One is just that you oftentimes will blank your opponent's removal or make your opponent's removal a lot less good. If you're playing very few threats to the board in a draw go style control deck, you might just be locking your opponent's removal in their hand, making it irrelevant for most of the game. If you're playing a tap out control deck, as we mentioned, almost all of your board affecting cards are also going to be card advantage generating. Doesn't feel that good to Doomblade and Muldrifter because a lot of the value has already been accrued. So yeah, the removal spell isn't dead, but it's a lot less valuable. Same goes for making tokens. I think a good example here is token making planeswalkers. Yeah, if you have to arc lightning the 3 tokens that Elspeth just made, you can do that, but it's not going to feel great. So that's, I think, a natural advantage of these kinds of decks in a lot of environments. We also already mentioned this, but you have inevitability. If you drafted an effective control deck in a given environment, you should be more and more favored as the game goes on, and your cards are just better than your opponents in that sense, and you're playing really well in top deck mode.
I mean, I think that it very much also just comes down to personal preference. It's easy for us to want to say that we're all just, they're trying to win and maximize our win percentage, but that's definitely not true. Players have their preferences of the kinds of decks they like to play, and some people prefer a slower deck that gives them more space to do more interactive things. They just feel they have more fun being able to be in control of the game and generate card advantage and things like that. So, yeah, I mean, it's very much, I think, just a taste thing.
Challenges of control decks now. I think by definition, in many environments, you're essentially playing from behind, right? You are not the one setting the tempo, so your opponent, no matter what they're doing, whether they're aggro or mid-range or whatever, they're going to be the ones posing threats, and you are going to then be behind and have to answer those threats and keep up. And I think some players struggle in that situation. They struggle playing from behind, and that's kind of what you're setting yourself up for with a control deck until the mid or late game. I think it also can punish a lack of environment-specific knowledge. I do not adhere to the somewhat often repeated idea that control decks are harder to play than aggro decks or mid-range decks. Some people will be like, oh, aggro's brainless and control's super hard. I don't think that's true. I think all these decks have lots of depth and complexity, and if you think your aggro deck is brainless, I challenge you to record yourself playing it and then hire somebody for a coaching session and see exactly how well you did in your quote-unquote brainless deck. But I do think that if you are drafting a new cube or an environment you're not familiar with, control specifically is a little bit more challenging because, again, by definition, you are trying to stop your opponent's strategy. If you don't know what their strategy is, that's going to make it harder to know when to use removal, how to use your answers, just how you're supposed to sequence things when you're drafting, whether you have to prioritize disfigures or whether you have to prioritize board wipes. All those sorts of questions, I think, are somewhat contingent upon meta knowledge of the environment.
I think it does obviously still go both ways. Like, you're not necessarily sure, is an aggressive deck really focused on 1 mana 2/1s, or does it need a little bit more beef and bigger stuff to go over some things? But I think you're definitely right. I feel like maybe it's not about what is more challenging in terms of what has like the highest ceiling of mastery, because I think that there is a high ceiling of mastery in all these kinds of decks. But I think the floor of feeling competent is very different, where if you draft an aggro deck and you curve out, you play your creatures, you use a removal spell, it's pretty easy to find a sequence that feels reasonable, even if you're not finding necessarily the optimal sequence. Whereas in a control deck, the sequences are just much less structured, maybe is the way. And it's also challenging because you are playing multiple different types of cards with different effects, that how you mulligan can really not just like change your win percentage in a certain way, but make an entire game feel won or lost based on that mulligan decision. So I think that there is a something to control decks being more difficult, but I think it's less about it actually being more difficult, more about the way it feels.
I propose there's a big overlap in the Venn diagram between people that say aggro decks are easier to play or, brain dead or whatever, and people that complain when they lose that their opponent just had it and there's nothing they could have done.
Exactly, yeah. It's like, well, if you had in your control deck thought about your mulligans more, thought about your opponent's plan more, drafted more things that were going to be relevant early in the game, then maybe they wouldn't have just had it.
Yeah, or if you're just turning off your brain and playing your aggro deck and you're like, oh, they had a board wipe, I guess I could never have won. Well, yeah.
Oh, sure, also true.
That's what I mean, is like, anyway, another challenge is, we've mentioned this already, but I do think these decks require a more delicate balance of different kinds of spells. And yes, obviously, I don't think it's easier to draft a aggro deck or a control deck, but maybe the fail cases are better, right? Like, to your point, if you maybe don't have the best meta knowledge of a particular cube and you draft an aggro deck with like a less ideal curve, probably fine. But I've definitely seen people draft control decks in like the Bun Magic cube for the first time and just have almost no removal, like leaning really hard on counter spells. And it's like, actually, you really do need removal here. And now your deck is not just like a slightly wonky curve aggro deck, it's like kind of non-functional. Like, you can't really do that in this environment. And I think you could insert the same sort of problem, but for any given cube, right? Like you said, there are some cubes where like disenchants really matter. And if you don't know that and just don't prioritize the disenchant in the draft, all of a sudden your control deck, your whole plan is to stop your opponent's strategy, and now you just can't because their strategy is play a Mimic Vat. And you're like, great, awesome.
Ooh,
cool.
What cube could that have happened in?
So I do think that the amount you are punished for maybe not getting that right balance of spells can matter a lot. And again, a lot of the spells are less interchangeable, right? Like in an aggro deck, if you could simplify it and say, all right, well, I want to have a curve that looks like this, in a lot of packs, you'll have a choice between a 2-drop and a 1-drop that could both go in your deck, and you can make a decision based on curve. But for a control deck, you're making the decision between another removal spell and another cantrip, and that's a more nuanced decision than just 2 different threats at different points on the curve.
Right, or even just understanding in a particular environment what are the win conditions. Like, is it reasonable for me to be drafting Monastery Mentor, and can I make that work as a win condition in this environment? Or
always.
Would I rather have something like Dream Trawler that's just like a single big threat that's going to close out the game? And I think that lots of environments, either one of those cards will not function as well.
I want to talk about whether control decks have to be blue, Anthony. To answer the question, no. They don't.
I will answer no.
They don't have to be blue, but they very, very often are. First of all, I think half, I'm saying in big scare quotes, of control decks are going to be some kind of draw go, and for those decks you do need blue. So for that entire subcategory of control that is primarily playing with stack interaction, yeah, you got to have blue. That's what the color pie says, and so you're kind of eliminating all those styles of control decks if you are not playing blue. If you are playing a tap out control deck, you don't need blue. You
can play any of the other colors except green.
Wait, why not green?
Let's just be reasonable here.
I don't get it, but whatever. I think it's somewhat common for people that are new to Cube in general, if they're drafting a, typical good stuffy cube, to end up playing, a style of, black-white deck, where they, have a bunch of heuristics from Retail Limited or whatever, and they're like, I took a bunch of removal spells, and I took a decent curve.
I feel like green-black is the prototypical first cube. Where
Green-black
it's
can
just
also with it.
Yep, I drafted big creatures, and I drafted removal. This is, the lessons I've learned from Limited, and I'm bringing them over, and you end up green-black.
Or another thing I see often is, people playing a black-white deck with, a bunch of board wipes, and it's like, okay, you can theoretically do that, but here's one of the big problems. What does that deck do when it comes up against an equally slow deck that does have access to blue? Because now you are, I think, in a really tough position because you have committed to playing this type of strategy that cares about again, a mixture of specific cards, drawing the right cards at the right time, having the right answers for the right threats, but you don't have the card selection, the stack interaction, and in many cases, the most efficient card advantage that comes from playing blue. So I think that's a big question you have to answer, is if you are going to play a tap-out deck that does not have blue, what do you do against blue decks? I think there are answers to that question. One of those answers is just play a cube without blue. Like, the Jund cube of T-Pug does in fact have control decks, I can attest. I've played that cube, and some decks definitely just have a, strong control vibe. They play very few threats, they play tons of answers, and you can get away with that there because you never have to go up against the same deck, but also having blue. So,
wow, we finally fixed the color pie.
I mean, that's one of the ways you can do it, right? I mean, card advantage and, card selection, it's all relative, right? Like, you just need to have better than your opponent. And so in the Jund cube, you get a Sylvan Library, you get a couple Planeswalkers, you just commit to playing a bunch of removal spells, your Pernicious Deed, and you can definitely be a control deck. I drafted a pretty committed control deck in that cube where I was just playing Field of the Dead, a bunch of removal spells, and inevitability. So that's one way to do it. I think another type of cube where non-blue tap-out control can thrive is when the range of threats is narrower. Like, for example, if you know that creature removal is going to remove the vast, vast majority of things you care about, then stack interaction is less important because you know that my removal spell is going to kill anything that matters, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
We didn't say it, but I think that's the big advantage of stack interaction is the biggest catch-all. A counterspell will stop the most type of stuff compared to your average removal spell,
and
right?
very efficiently.
And usually very efficiently. Aside from things that can't be countered or have cast triggers, which in the broad history of Magic is very, very few things, Counterspell's just going to stop it. Meanwhile, if it's got an enter the battlefield ability, if it makes multiple game pieces when it comes into play, if it is relevant in the graveyard, I mean, I guess that's true with Counterspells too, but it's got a death trigger, all that kind of stuff. If it's just not a creature, right? They could just play a Sylvan Library and your creature removal doesn't do anything against it, and now it's a big problem. But I think in a cube where the range of threats is narrower, you can definitely get away with a non-blue tap-out control deck because you know that your removal spells are going to answer all the threats you need to be able to answer. I think the regular cube is kind of in this space. I think the regular cube, it's much easier to do a non-blue controlling style deck because there are almost no planeswalkers and you really avoid non-creature threats. It's hard to think of almost any in that cube.
Yeah, I mean, the most difficult one is honestly Untethered Express.
Untethered Express is so hard to deal with. There are also precedent from Constructed. For example, another non-blue control deck that has a storied history in Constructed is Mono Black Control, MBC. That deck has had moments in different Constructed formats and standard eras where it's been viable. And I think it's for a very good reason. It has answers to all the questions we just posed, right? First of all, Black has access to pretty much everything but stack interaction that Blue has, right? It's got card advantage. You can just draw cards. It's got removal. It's got hand hate, which is kind of unique to Black, which is another way to kind of proactively control the game. And really importantly, that last one, hand hate, is so good against the blue deck. So you have a plan when you come up against a deck that is like your deck but playing blue. You just start thought seizing and duressing them, and that's just a huge nightmare for control decks because you're going to take their key pieces that they spent so much time carefully crafting, or they're going to have to spend a counterspell on your one-mana spell, which is not where they want to be.
Definitely. I think that's also worth tying back to just the discussion about are control decks more difficult to play, and that's something that I think is especially difficult for new players. And you'll see a lot of people will cast their Thoughtseize and be like, oh, I got to take your 6-mana Planeswalker. And
no, you don't. You almost never do.
You should probably take my 2-drop or my 3-drop so that you're throwing me off my curve. But that is a difficult thing to intuit when you're newer to the game.
It's also meta-dependent, too. I mean, I think the more that the faster the tempo of a cube, the more that you just want to take your opponent off curve.
Yeah, there are definitely some contexts where it's I have answers to that. I'm going to play a creature with a bigger body, and I don't really care about your 2-drop, but context matters.
Yeah, I think it's especially true of the Kitesail Freebooter style creatures, because those are also almost never permanent answers because they're creatures and can die. I'm pretty much always just taking my opponent off their curve. Whatever they're going to do next, I'm taking with Kitesail Freebooter or Mesmeric Fiend or Tide Hollow Sculler. This came up last night. Your opponent Patrick was playing you in the regular cube, and he played a Tide Hollow Sculler and said, "Can I phone a friend?" and then asked Max and I what he should take. Because you had a hand that was really good against hand hate. You had multiple really good threats, multiple removal spells, and you had multiple 3-drops. You had both Call of the Herd and Thrashing Bronodon. And both Max and I were this is not great, but this is an easy Call of the Herd. Just take the next best thing he was going to play, make him play a Thrashing Bronodon next, which is worse than Call of the Herd.
Yeah, it's kind of a take you off your tempo and make you use your removal spell kind of card.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a little bit of a
So that's
digression.
A whole type of control that doesn't require blue. And obviously in certain context, you'll find different decks that function that way. There's actually, I think, a like mono black control deck in the Degenerate Microcube because hand hate is so good there. You can definitely just play essentially hand hate deck with any old win condition you want and just plan to shut down your opponent with hand hate. Should we get into how to draft a control deck, Anthony?
We should.
Is that the...
You should. I don't know how to draft a control deck.
Is that the tone of a man who's not confident in giving advice on how to draft a control deck?
That's exactly it. You found my tone.
I'm not going to profess to be an expert at this, but here's how I go about it. I think the first thing you need to prioritize, first and foremost, is removal. You have to stop your opponent's strategy. So your deck needs to have removal, counter spells, board wipes. It has to have ways to deal with your opponent's threats. This sounds obvious, but again, I have seen people draft control decks that are like 2 board wipes, 4 counter spells, and a whole bunch of card draw. And it's like, that's not really a control deck. You're just drawing a bunch of cards, and then you're still not going to have enough removal to deal with all your opponent's threats, even after you've drawn them all.
And I think that can happen very easily when you're just, thinking about picks sort of one at a time,
yes.
And you're thinking, okay, well,
take the best card of every pack.
Here's a good board wipe. I don't have a board wipe yet, but there's like a really good card draw spell, so I'll take that first, and I'll get the board wipe when it comes a little bit later. And it's really easy to say that many, many times during a draft and sort of end up at the end being like, oh, I have actually a lot fewer wraths than I thought, even though I was maybe evaluating them like 2 picks lower than everyone else at the table, and now I've ended up with none of them. Or, that's obviously extreme, but you can definitely get in those situations, so it's helpful just to, if you're playing in a casual pod, look at your picks that you've made so far, and change your picks drastically depending on what you need, because your control deck does need a balance of these different types of effects.
That's exactly where I was going with this. I think this is the unique challenge of drafting a control deck. Again, I think drafting any kind of deck is hard. It's just that the challenge is different. And the challenge here is that you often don't just get to pick the best card, quote unquote, in your colors. You don't get to say well, my deck would play these 3 cards, which one's the most powerful? Because more than just having a bunch of powerful cards in your deck, it's important to have this mixture of spells be just right. And that is kind of similar, right, for an aggro deck. You can't just take the best card repeatedly if the best card continues to be 3 and 4 drops. You still need to think about your curve. But I think it's a different kind of consideration with control because you need this range of effects.
Yeah, I personally find it much easier, and this might be helpful for me having this conversation about why I often do end up trending towards sort of mid-rangey strategies, is it's much easier to pick what's the best 2 to 4 drop in the colors I'm in than it is to think about both your curve in a really specific way for aggro decks and your distribution of spells, as well as your curve for control decks.
Yeah, I mean, the number of times I have been in blue-black control and taken Disfigure of a Jace the Mind Sculptor in the Bud Magic Cube, it happens all the time. And yes, Jace is a more powerful card. It's a better card than Disfigure, but you need a certain amount of Disfigures for your deck to function, and you don't need that many Jace the Mind Sculptors for your deck to function. So anyway, I think that's the most important thing, is find ways to stop your opponent's strategy, whatever that means in the meta you happen to be in. I think the second most important thing is establishing card advantage. And with these 2 things, that's the foundation of your control deck. If you have ways to remove your opponent's threats, let's say mostly 1 for 1, and you have ways to draw 2 cards, divination, then you can just imagine this is going to, over the course of the game, mean I'm going to eventually win because I can just continue to generate card advantage and answer my opponent's threats and stop their deck. Again, this card advantage doesn't have to be card draw. I mean, it can be Treasure Cruise. It can also be board wipes, planeswalkers. It could be the board affecting card advantage like Mole Drifters and Ravenous Chupacabras we talked about.
Would you even say Adventures and other just inherent 2 for 1 kind of cards?
Yeah, I think Adventures would definitely fit in this category. It kind of depends what the spell does, but for the most part, you just need some sources of card advantage. And I think these are the 2 pillars of the control deck. The last piece is just finding that inevitability, right? Find your win condition. And I truly think that you can prioritize this so much lower than these other 2 things. If you succeed in stopping your opponent's strategy and generating card advantage, it kind of doesn't matter how you win the game. It can be through a creature land, it can be through a creature of your own that you can protect, it could be through a planeswalker, it can be through a big stroke of genius or brain geyser if you're playing in the right environment. It can be a lot of things. You do need to think about it, because you need it at the end of the draft. You got to have some way to win the game, but it is, I think, an easy third priority to those first 2. And again, I think this is where a lot of people get tripped up. They're trying to take the best card out of every pack. And
the best card is easy to conflate with the card that ends the game.
Sure, you get to end of pack 1, and you have 3 planeswalkers, but only 1 single target removal spell and 1 cantrip. And it's you're drafting a mid-range deck at that point. And if you think you're drafting a control deck, then you're going to make decisions in the rest of the draft that are ill-advised based on that strategy because you do not have sufficient ways to stop your opponent's threats. I mean, your planeswalkers could have removal attached to them. It's nuanced, but you don't really want to be thinking about how you're going to end the game actively. Like, I think you're going to wheel a way to win the game. You'll be like, great, I got this late Celestial Colonnade or Creeping Tar Pit. There it is. That's my inevitability. Or if you haven't wheeled something or kind of gotten it for free because you didn't have to, because there was some pack that didn't have any card advantage or removal in it, then you get to pack 3 and you can think, all right, now I really have to kind of focus on how I'm actually going to win the game. And it is so rare that this is going to be difficult for you to actually find in a cube. I mean, people love putting just great cards in their cube. The chance you'll completely fail to find one, even if you don't even start thinking about it till pack 3, it's basically non-existent. So those are your 3 things. And I think, again, the unique challenge here is getting the right balance of those things. That's going to depend on the metagame. How much cheap removal you need is going to depend on the metagame. How much stack interaction is going to depend on the metagame. How much answers you need for non-creature permanents, which is another kind of variable. It's under that removal category, but like how many of those you need as compared to just creature answers is going to matter. Understanding that balance, I think, is really important, and finding that right mixture is the real challenge of drafting a control deck. All right, let's close by giving some real-world examples, Anthony, and talk about what the control decks look like in each of our cubes in which control was a reasonable word, which is to say everything but the Turbo Cube. Or am I wrong? Do you think there is something that resembles a control deck in the Turbo Cube?
I think there is that we haven't cracked yet, because I think specifically a lot of the decks still are pretty creature-based, and there are a number of Wraths that you can cast potentially on your turn 1 or turn 2.
That's where it falls apart for me, is because like we talked about this deck caring about inevitability, going to the late game, stopping off their opponent's threats.
The late game, turn 2.
And maybe that's true, right? Maybe the games are so fast that it counts as the late game on turn 2 or turn 3. But the decks are so explosive, it really feels like a combo duel to me in a way that I think obviates a lot of the like aggro mid-range control spectrum.
Yeah, I think that there is more space that we can explore there, but it's probably not relevant to this conversation.
Yeah. Let's start with the Blood Magic Cube. One of my primary goals is to support like a fully dedicated Drago control deck. That's something that's important to me, and so I've included enough cards to make that possible. I have tons of removal running around in every color in which it's reasonable to have it. I've got tons of counterspells. I basically never see a cube that has a higher density of cheap removal and counterspells than mine. It almost never comes up, and I look at a lot of cube lists. I'm really leaning really heavily on these features, and largely that is to support this Drago control deck. I'm talking decks that have like 2 ways to win the game, right? They just have Celestial Colonnade and Shark Typhoon. That is it. Every other card in their deck does not say win the game on it, but they're capable of slowing their opponent down enough, and those are 2 sticky enough win conditions that they don't need anything else. These decks are almost always blue-white, because that gives you access to blue, which is essential for Drago control, and white, which has the best board wipes. I have both Balance and Terminus, which there's a lot of ways to set up in white. I have seen it in blue-black before, though I think it's a little bit trickier to pull off, and a lot of times those decks end up being a little more proactive than just sort of full Drago, because they have instant speed threats that they're playing at the end of their opponent's turn instead of like waiting to have a big like turn the corner moment. And a lot of times these decks do also splash. So, they're base blue-white, but they might be splashing black or splashing red or splashing something to give them a little bit of additional edge. That's one type of control deck. There are also, I think, plenty of decks you can describe as tap-out control. And this is really where I think in this cube you need the card quality that comes from 3 or 3 colors and a splash. And to me, like some of the hallmark cards of a like tap-out control deck in this cube are your Wrenn and 6s, your Uros, your Kolaghan's Command, even a card like Fractured Identity, which I think some other people identify as like a Drago card. I don't think it's particularly good in Drago because it's a 5-mana sorcery that doesn't even win the game immediately when it's resolved. So I really like that a lot more in tap-out control, where I'm not worried about holding up mana, and I'm just going to be answering things once they resolve. I think that's what Fractured Identity is really good at. A lot of those cards end up being gold, which is why I think these decks in the Blood Magic Cube end up being 3 or 4 color decks more often than not.
Uro is a really interesting sort of standout there because it just does so many different things at once. It's like a tremendous generator of resources in every sense. Like it generates more mana, it generates more cards, it gains you some life, which is going to help catch you up, and then ultimately it is also going to be your win condition. So that is where I think green sort of starts turning into a control deck, especially with some of these monocolored cards, or gives you tools for a control deck.
Yeah, control is my favorite context in which to play Uro. I actually don't like it that much from a like cube designer perspective as a like mid-range card. It does some things for mid-range I don't love, but I just adore it so much. Yeah, that's a big one. But I just adore it so much as a like control win condition in those like, you know, kind of 3-4 color pile decks that I can't say no to it. And then, you know, we covered all these other types of control decks. There is no prison in the Bun Magic Cube. There is nothing really resembling mono black control. You can't quite get there just because of the range of threats you have to answer and the importance of stack interaction. And also just, you know, you want the 2-for-1 removal that you don't really get in black, at least in my cube. You can't have a K-Command quality card in mono black in the Bun Magic Cube. So those are the two kind of categories I think of control decks. These hard draw go control, which are like pure or full control. Like no one would ever argue these are not control decks. And then maybe the more muddled tap out control decks, which I still think are very much control decks. They're going quite slow. Their main goal was to shut down their opponent, but they're shutting them down while they're generating board presence and just generating value over time.
Yeah, I mean, did we also, I think maybe we skipped over the difference between stack interaction versus removal, even when it comes to creatures, just that a lot of creatures do stuff that the damage is done once they've resolved.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you are pointing your Disfigure at your Esper Sentinel or at Thraben Inspector, or maybe you've let them have a Mother of Runes for a turn, the stack interaction is just going to actually fully answer those, whereas removal will not necessarily.
Yeah, and that's another big hole for the like mono black control decks or other tap out control decks, is you need ways to get around that. So yeah, I think that's kind of the range of control decks in the Bun Magic Cube. The goal of that cube is to cover a wide range of the aggro to control spectrum, and so I consciously try to support that kind of diversity of control decks, though it's not really an environment where you can do prison, and it's not an environment where you can do any kind of combo with a capital C. I have notes on the regular cube, but do you have thoughts on what control decks look like in the regular cube before I blabber on about my thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, so my main cube is much lower power level, plays a lot more like a master set or like a limited set, and I think like those kinds of formats, it doesn't necessarily have the range of aggro and control, doesn't necessarily have the range of speeds. Everybody's a little bit closer to some flavor of mid-range. I think it's also been just because it is a much more novel environment. We don't necessarily have these themes that we can take from like broader cube ideas or from constructed formats and apply them to be like, oh yeah, here's what a control deck looks like. I'm putting Wrath of God, some cheap removal, and Jace the Mind Sculptor in a deck, and that's my control deck. So we're kind of still figuring it out, even though we've had this cube around in the playgroup for many years. Do I actually have any specific thoughts, though?
Yeah, but I think it makes a lot of sense. I agree with that. It's a different way of thinking about that cube, which is, yeah, you're not pulling archetypal inspiration from constructed Magic, really. I mean, maybe there's some decks in that cube you could describe as like fringe standard decks from their era.
Yeah, fringe standard decks from
but that's the closest
2010.
You're getting. There's nothing in that cube that resembles any modern deck or legacy deck or historic deck. It is much more like a good limited deck than it is a constructed deck in that environment, which does mean that you're playing on a narrower range of that spectrum. I would argue that draw-go control is not really a thing in that cube. Every deck is playing to the board. You just don't have a density of cheap removal and cheap counterspells and board wipes, efficient board wipes, to actually make draw-go control a thing. If you were to like sit down and try and put together the best draw-go control list from the cube you could with like 100% card selection with 100% control over exactly what cards you ran, I still don't think it would be a great deck or be able to hang with some of the better drafted decks in the cube.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the Wraths, there are a couple of them, but they start at 5 mana, and that's a big cost when the rest of the environment is pretty aggressive. So I think that those cards we are figuring out do kind of have a home, but it's not necessarily just this like classic style, I'm going to play these Wraths and play some draw spells. That's not necessarily going to work. And similarly, there isn't a huge density of efficient removal or efficient counterspells. A lot of the red and black removal, it's just going to be more efficient against the creatures, the early threats. And, you know, has that flexibility of you can cast it later on in the game, whereas making sure you can actually like curve out and have a counterspell on every turn is much more difficult here.
Yeah, I mean, even the simple question of like, okay, let's assume you've got a board wipe in your opening hand. What are decks in your cube doing on the other turns before that, right? You just don't have enough like non-creature spells that are relevant that you could reasonably craft a curve leading up to a board wipe without committing to the board somehow.
You just play your bounce lands and twiddle your thumbs and try to...
I mean, that is the actual answer, and that's why I think those decks are not really a thing.
Try not to look suspicious, keep a straight face.
Exactly, yeah. Oh, darn, I keep drawing so many lands.
I guess I play this equipment.
How weird of me to not play anything. That's something I've noticed that the newer players, like, It takes a long time, I think, a surprisingly long time playing Magic to really start thinking about what your opponent is doing in like a putting yourself in your opponent's shoes way. And I can't tell you how many times at like a pre-release I've just done nothing on the first 4 or 5 turns of the game, and my opponent clearly hasn't even really registered it. They're just like, wow, I'm doing great. This is a good game for me. And there's no thought to like, what could he possibly have in his hand
rude.
if he's done nothing in all these turns of the game?
And I think it's been interesting, though. There has been a little bit of a shift in our local play group where I have started seeing people put more wraths in, like an incidental wrath in their deck. I saw somebody had it in a deck where they had lots of looters, so it was like, okay, that's pretty reasonable. You have some card selection. Or I had by invitation only in my otherwise like sort of mid-rangey kind of aggressive green-white deck this week.
Yeah, it's a wrath.
But yeah, I mean, it also has some additional flexibility, but like there are going to be some games where I'm like, my opponent's playing a bunch of creatures.
Oh, no, I'm drawing so many lands.
Can I afford to just play bounce lands and twiddle my thumbs? And that has been adding some interesting tension and sort of making people think about that, which is kind of interesting.
All by way of saying, I think that the control decks in the regular cube are like quintessential tap-out control decks. You do want to play the literal card Mull Drifter. I was looking for the card Reflector Mage today. I was looking back at some control deck pictures from the Discord, or we take pictures of all of our deck lists from all of our cubes just to like remind myself of some winning control decks in the regular cube, and they tend to always have Reflector Mage in it, and it's like,
yeah,
well, I mean, it's a great example of a card that like it's not card advantage, it's actually just tempo, like you're just buying time, you're not actually answering anything. But that's exactly the kind of card that like tap out control is thrilled to have, because your whole point is to win in a long game, and nothing allows you to get to the long game better than bouncing a thing, preventing them from playing it again, and now having a 2/3 in play that can brawl, trade with a threat, do something. Like, it's just a great... You're just playing like speed bumps the deck, basically. And I think those are the best and most effective control decks in the regular cube, which incidentally, or not, do often have blue, even though they are mostly tap out control decks.
Yeah, I think that the another thing about this environment is there aren't a ton of easy sources of card advantage. You do kind of have to work for your value, which is intentional. So that little bit of, that one Rain of Revelation and that couple cantrips in your deck kind of are pretty important, and you're not necessarily going to get that in other parts of the color pie. I thought that this deck that Max drafted last week also was pretty interesting, where we've talked a lot about how green-blue has kind of been struggling, and he did kind of draft a green-blue with some white removal spell control deck.
I looked back at that list too right before this episode, and he beat me just last night, and I thought I did have a really good deck. I didn't think I did. I had a really good deck, but I had this like red-black mid-range deck that was full of removal, and he did the thing of make my removal look absolutely stupid, which is in both our games. He played Squirrel Nest, and I was like, cool, that's fine. That's not a problem for me at all. And he also, like, his win condition was Untethered Express, and he would just buy time, and then I had so much sorcery speed interaction and so little instant speed interaction, and there was one turn where I had a Executioner's Capsule on board, and I had saved up a Drag to the Underworld in hand, because I also knew he had Snakeskin Veil in his deck, and I'm like, I have to get rid of that stupid train. So I got to a turn where I could do both.
This is a movie. That's the, like, trailer opening, is we gotta get rid of that stupid train.
So I got to a turn where I could do both. He had, I think, 3 cards in hand, and I had to drag to the Underworld first because I needed the discount from having the Executioner's Capsule in play in order to afford to do both in the turn.
That's peak regular cube there.
So I did the drag to the Underworld first, and he remanded it, and then I was like, I'm going to lose if you have it, and I Executioner's Capsule, and he also had Snakeskin Veil, and it's like, that was his control deck, was I'm going to stop what your deck is doing, and what my deck was largely doing was removing his threats. And he was like, well, I'm just not going to let you do that either, because I'm going to play Squirrel Nest, and I'm going to play Untethered Express, and it's going to be really hard for you to win.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's critical here is this does have all those components we were talking about. So he has creatures that are creating card advantage, things like Courser of Crufix and Fibblethip that, again, it's just going to make your removal spells not that valuable.
Fibblethip is a great tap-out control card. It's like, if you trade with a cheap creature, that's just a cantripping removal spell. Like, yeah. Fibblethip is a fantastic tap-out control card.
There's also interaction with things like Cankerbloom and Dungeon Geist. And then, yeah, the Untethered Express and Celestial Colonnade as well are just legit win conditions that are difficult to deal with from a lot of opponents.
Yeah, he had basically no clock ever, but just ran me out of... like, he would basically answer all my threats till I was just left with removal in hand. And I was like, I guess I'll start removing your squirrels because it's better than doing nothing.
Let's drag that squirrel to the underworld out of spite.
But it sure feels bad.
Anyway, so how did that make you feel?
I mean, it was fine. I liked my deck. It was still a good deck. It definitely... It's funny because I had the answers, right? Like, I think the cube is brilliantly designed. I had both Archfiend of Ifnir in my deck, which is fantastic against Squirrel Nest.
Oh, yeah.
And I also had Echoing Decay. And it's like, that's going to be fantastic against Squirrel Nest too.
A brilliant addition. Who could have suggested that?
Who could have possibly suggested that? I never drew Echoing Decay, so get good, scrub. I also just, I had, in our game 3, maybe it was our game 2. I might not have even won one. No, I think I did win one. Did I? Who knows? In our last game we played, I forget whether it was game 2 or game 3, I had Archfiend of Ifnir in hand from the early turns of the game, and I had multiple ways to discard cards. I had Bone Shards, I had a Scrapwork Mutt, and I was just like walking him into making a bunch of squirrels, and then I was just going to blow him out. He had a Fibblethip in play, he had a bunch of squirrels. I was just like, I'm going to get you once I get to enough mana to play Archfiend of Ifnir, and then also discard a card without passing the turn, because I know you have a whole swath of removal, and I'm probably not going to get to keep the Archfiend for very long. And I just never drew enough lands to do them both. I got mana screwed. In that game, I also drew a full 4 cards off Maze Mind Tome. I spent the first 5 turns of the game just dumping my mana into Maze Mind Tome to draw extra cards, and still got stuck on mana. So, you know what happens sometimes. My point is, the cube was brilliantly designed. I had the answers in my deck. I could have broken differently, and it just didn't.
Yeah, you hate to see it.
There's also no prison in the regular cube.
No prison.
No prison. Let's talk about the neoclassical cube. This is my old school cube. It is vast majority old border. I do allow myself to have some new border treats when I feel they are in line with the old border aesthetic and the old border design philosophy. A good example is I recently added Fleshbag Marauder, which I think is a perfectly old school card. There's plenty of Necrotals in the early days of Magic, black creatures that remove creatures on ETB, and Edicts I think were also a lot more popular in the early days of Magic, so Fleshbag Marauder fits in nicely.
When was that first printed? That, really does just feel so
classic. It was first printed in Alara Reborn. Shards of Alara, 2008. It is kind of old. It wasn't that far after the new border that they printed the first Fleshbag Marauder, but anyway, that's a good example of the kinds of new border cards that are included in this cube. This cube also has Draw Go Control, I would say, but it is way less efficient than Draw Go Control in the Button Magic cube. You're going to have fewer cheap counter spells and fewer efficient board wipes. And that's just because the meta is different. The decks are way less efficient. A curve out from an aggro deck in the neoclassical cube is probably going to be a full 2 or 3 turns slower to actually kill you than a curve out from a Bun Magic cube deck. So you can have more time to find the answers you need and set up shop. Prophetic Bolt is very good in the tap out control decks in the neoclassical cube because getting that card advantage is important. And that's 5 mana to deal 4 to something and draw a card from the top 4 of your library, right? It's an expensive spell that would never work in the Bun Magic cube, but is quite good in the neoclassical cube. So that's the kind of distinction between what the Draw Go Control decks look like. But I think you definitely can draft a deck that has basically no threats and is just planning to answer your opponent's threats, mostly at instant speed.
Yeah, I played against a really, really potent example of this that just countered every single thing I did. And then I lost to Prophetic Bolt on my end step, and then Urza's Rage to my face, kicked next turn just to deal 10 damage to me. It's that was his only win condition, and that's all he needed.
And that is what a lot of the win conditions look like in the control decks. They are Fireball, Urza's Rage, Brain Geyser, or Stroke of Genius to mill your opponent out. There's a full mill package with Grindstone. Grindstone is a really great example of a draw go card.
I even sided in Millstone against that particular opponent because I was like, okay, he's just got all the removal for all the counter spells for my creatures. I'm just going to sneak this in on turn 1, and then here's my win condition, mill that Urza's Rage. He had a disenchant.
Rude. So rude. But yeah, because the decks are slower, you have a lot more time to get to your 10 mana to cast your kicked Urza's Rage or your huge amount of mana to kill them with Stroke of Genius or Fireball. So those are very oftentimes win conditions in these kinds of decks. There are also things that are much closer to combo wins in this cube than there are in either the Bun Magic or regular cube. I think that's also kind of in keeping with the old school ethos. People like to say that there's a lot of power creep among cards, and there is, but power creep is also not a linear thing, because if you look back at Alpha, it's got plenty of cards that are more broken than anything they would ever print today. It's just power creep in a certain type of way, right? And this cube has Fast Bond and Necropotence and Mind Over Matter and all these combo card potential cards that are much more committal and build around, but you definitely can have a control deck that wins the game with Mind Over Matter and Arcanist the Omnipotent and Kumwal, or just Arcanist and mana rocks and a big brain geyser. Like, you can win in a very splashy control way after you've drawn the game out really long. Interestingly, I'm going to argue that I don't actually think tap-out control is as much of a thing in this cube. I think it is kind of a hallmark of new card design. Like, all the cards I described as like the quintessential tap-out control cards of the Bud Magic Cube, to me, are emblematic of like the kinds of powerful cards they print now that they never printed before. Like, self-contained efficient value engines that just, go over the top kind of all on their own, or like do it all. And the closest we have to stuff like that in like the neoclassical era is like Siege Gang Commander. But that's really just a mid-range card because it doesn't stop your opponent at all. I mean, I guess you can start sacrificing goblins if you untap with it and removing their stuff, but like, I don't really think there's a tap-out control deck. I think you either have to be playing full like Drago control, I'm going to stop everything you're doing, or you have to be doing something more proactive. I don't think you can afford to just say, I'm going to answer you with this like kind of grindy attrition stuff. I think you have to either be proactive or totally fall back on the Drago style.
Is it also that a lot of the interactive spells tend to be a little bit more limited in scope? I mean, in a very literal way, just with like protection and things like that, but also burn spells aren't going to hit your big reanimated creatures that you... Yeah. So I feel
there's a bigger variety of threats. Like, in that cube, artifacts and enchantments matter a lot really more than in the Bun Magic Cube or the regular cube. There's more varied strategies. Like I said, your opponent could just be trying to mill you out. Your opponent could be trying to combo off. Your opponent could be trying to reanimate something. Like, there's a lot more variety what the decks can be doing, which makes it maybe harder to stop it in a tap-out control kind of way. But, yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is a relatively new cube. We've drafted this way less than the Bud Magic Cube or the regular cube, so maybe there's still a tap-out control deck to emerge here somewhere. And if there was one to emerge, I have to imagine Pernicious Deed would be a very important part of that deck. That strikes me as a very powerful card that really helps tap out control decks, but yeah, I don't know. That doesn't really feel like a thing. However, prison decks are much more of a thing here than in either of the previous cubes we've discussed. I am pursuing prison style effects with like welder decks, for example, bringing back static orbs and winter orbs and tangle wires, and there's more land destruction in this cube. This cube is definitely allows you to more proactively just like shut your opponent down if you can draw the right combination of cards. And like I kind of mentioned, I think this deck is hard to make work in a drafted environment, and I think I still have a lot of figuring out to do to make these decks competitive and consistent with the other decks in the cube, but it's something I'm trying to make work because the prison stuff, to me, is also emblematic of the early days of Magic. When they designed the first Magic cards, they were like, well, we should let everyone destroy anything, right? Like, why not have a bunch of land destruction? Why not have a bunch of like ways to interact with all the different types of game pieces?
Yeah, they were like, here's the 5 types of game pieces. Now let's design all the different ways they can interact with each other.
Yeah, which it makes total sense. It took, some R&D and some playtesting and some experience for them to learn that actually maybe lands shouldn't really be destroyed that often. Maybe that's not like the healthiest thing for gameplay. And I'm not pursuing that kind of quote unquote healthy gameplay with this cube. I'm pursuing like a nostalgic early days of Magic kind of vibe. So yeah, land destruction is on the menu, and that's allows for a more prison style of deck than other types of cubes we've discussed. The last cube I want to discuss is just the Degenerate Microcube real quick. I mean, this is on the same spectrum as the Turbo Cube, I think, in that it is a radically different environment, and so how much these words really apply is up for debate.
But the cards all still do what they say they do.
The cards do what they say they do, and I definitely think there are clear control decks in that cube. One of them, I guess you could call a Drago control deck, though kind of like the Turbo Cube games are so short that you're not drawing and going that much. You're just going to have the answers in the first couple turns of the game. But there's definitely a deck that is very heavily blue and leans really hard on stack interaction and just has counterspells for everything you could possibly want to cast. And that's because many of the threats in that cube win on the spot or are near impossible to answer once resolved, right? Like, if it's a combo, if they're just going to resolve their Auriok Salvagers and combo off, you're not going to have a chance to remove it. You're never going to get priority ever again, right? You have to, I mean, you do literally get priority with that combo, I know, but you're not going to get to untap ever again, right? So you have to remove the thing on the stack. Or if it's, their channel, they're going to channel into Emrakul. You can't counter Emrakul, so you better stop that channel right now. So for that reason, stack interaction is really, really important in that cube, and that is what one category of control decks looks like. All those control decks will tend to have combo win conditions. So one of my favorite decks in that cube is just the card Flash, and then like 1 or 2 flash threats, a World Spine Worm, a Triplicate Titan, whatever. And then the rest of my deck is basically just free counter spells. And I'll play like 3 lands. And it's like, I don't need lands. I only got to get to 2 mana, and I get to 2 mana whenever I want. I'll cast Flash on turn 5 or whatever. I just have to guarantee that I can stop anything that can beat my flashed out World Spine Worm before I get to do it. So that's kind of one category of control decks. And like I mentioned earlier, I also think this cube has a deck that feels a lot like mono black control, because the other type of removal spell that can interact with things before they hit the stack is discard. You either have to have stack interaction or discard. Actual factual removal is way worse in that cube for a variety of reasons. All the reasons I already mentioned, the fact that a lot of the reanimated threats have some sort of protection or shroud or indestructible. You really just want to be stopping at things before they happen, and so really heavy black discard decks are also a thing, and they'll often win the game just by continuing to attack over and over again with their Mesmeric Fiend or attacking with a Mishra's Factory through like a very just attrition-style win. And I guess you could describe that as tap-out control, right? You're not holding up mana. You're tapping out control into discard spell, into discard spell, into discard spell, and then you eventually kill them with your grief, right? That is the strategy of that deck. And those are the 2 decks I think that are most clearly control decks in that cube. Oh, I'm sorry. Except for the third one, this cube 100% has fully dedicated prison decks. There is full Mishra's Workshop decks. You can go turn 1 Trinisphere, into turn 2 Lodestone Golem, into turn 3 make a copy for Lodestone Golem. That is very common. There's a whole deck that just plays Urza Saga and then all of the taxing stuff and never plans to cast its own spells, like does not win through casting spells, just puts Chalice of the Voids and Spheres of Resistance in play and wins by activating Urza Saga and making tokens. So those decks are very, very dedicated, committed prison decks, and that's part of why I love that cube, is that those decks are viable, and they feel a lot less... I mean, they're still as narrow as they are in other cubes, but because your deck is so much smaller, you're spending way fewer picks on having that package, right? If you have Workshop, you really only need like 3 other cards to be like a pretty good stacks prison deck. You don't have to like pick 20 cards to make that deck work. So that's the sort of range of control decks in the Degenerate Micro Cube. But I think between those 4 cubes, that's a pretty wide range of what constitutes a control deck.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think what other space we could explore. I mean, I'm trying to think of like thematic tribal cube maybe would have a less clear definition of a control deck, because different archetypes are more just thinking about how am I drafting within this sort of more narrow synergy that cares about cards interacting in a certain way together to come up with a like proactive on the board plan, and it's not so much about different colors caring about the speed in the same way. So that's maybe a case where we could see a more narrow definition. But I would guess that even in some of these more like novel, flavorful environments, if we really sit down and try and play them optimally, there's going to be still potentially a fastest deck and a slowest deck, and the slowest one might still be pretty slow.
Yeah, the only other type of cube I can think of that maybe you and I have a lot less experience with is like commander cubes, first of all. Like, I don't know what multiplayer cube
as soon
control
as we get
looks
multiplayer,
like.
That's a totally different thing.
Sure, that's one thing. And then also like really big game swingy cubes, like the Live the Dream cube, for example.
Sure.
I have no idea what a control deck looks like in the
That's
Live
a
the
great
Dream
call,
cube.
yeah.
And that could be totally different from anything we've discussed here. I truly have no idea.
I mean, in some ways, the Live the Dream cube is the control doesn't exist cube, because everybody should have an opportunity to live their dreams.
And yet, I bet there probably is a deck that wins through stopping what its opponent is doing, because maybe their dream is resolving Guile and Dovescape or whatever. Like, maybe your dream is stopping your opponent from doing anything. I don't know.
Some people have dark dreams.
Some people have problems that need to be interrogated. So yeah, I'm sure there's things we haven't touched, but to me, I think this is a decent primer on, like, you and I draft a lot of cubes, probably more than, we got to be in the top, 1 or 2% in terms of drafting different types of cubes of people out there. I know very few people that draft as many different types of cubes as we do, and so I hope this is a fairly comprehensive general primer to what control might look like across different cube environments. That's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. As you're hearing this should be your last chance to get in your responses on the Wilds of Eldraine survey. If all goes well, we plan to come to you next week with our community set review, so get in those survey responses. And if you have a hot take you want to send in via voice memo, get those in as well. I've got a couple already and would love to bolster that with even more voices from the community. So record a little voice memo on your phone with your hot take and send it to mail@luckypaper.co, or hit me up on one of the social networks.
I think this is proving to be the most popular set in terms of our survey responses. We're getting close. I think in a week we can make it with your help.
Are we really getting close to MH2? MH2 was nuts.
It was a lot of people. It's a lot.
I haven't sent the newsletter yet. The newsletter usually queues another 30 or 40 people to actually send them in.
It's a lot, and also people have left a lot of big, chunky, thoughtful comments.
Which Parker is forced to read legally. He's legally obligated to read all of those.
I'm going to read them all as well, and it's going to be a lot.
I'm going to read some of them, everybody. I am not going to commit to reading them all, but I do browse them as they come in. Anyway, get those in, and we'll see you at CubeCon in, 8 weeks, right?
No, it's got to be way further
I think
out.
actually when this episode comes out, it's going to be more like 7 weeks.
Wow.
It's coming up. So
Time doesn't exist.
We'll see hopefully a lot of you in Madison and Wisconsin. And if you're not going to be in Madison, I don't think I'm saying anything I'm not allowed to say, but I am on the coverage team again this year like I was last year, and Justin and the team has really stepped up the coverage game, so expect some of the best Cube coverage you've ever seen, I think, if I may say.
We get a lot of listeners asking for just more paper Cube content. Where is it? There's not a lot of it. And that's what CubeCon is going to be. Sure, it's going to be a great event that we're going to have fun time at.
I just like the tagline of CubeCon being paper Cube content. Generation. No,
it's going to be a great experience for everyone who can attend, but it's also going to be an awesome experience for everybody that just wants to see all the great content that's going to come out of it. So
yeah, I don't want to spoil anything. They did announce the rest of the coverage team. There's a lot of great people that are coming in. Becky Bear, J-Bro, Justin, Emma Partlow, David McDarby. Good coverage team this year, and I got to say, we're working hard. We got a lot of good plans. So if you can't make it to CubeCon, check out that coverage when it comes up. Anyway, that's it for this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I thinking really hard about magic cards and speaking into microphones about it. I counter your spell.